There's something in Apex that's so grossly misunderstood that it actively costs people games. It's a fundamental piece of knowledge that even some professional players get wrong, and if implemented correctly will improve your decision making tenfold and make your game of Apex just noticeably easier. Understanding resources is a key understanding of how Apex works. You may already be familiar with heals, ammo, and shields, but this higher level concept that players of all skill brackets get wrong, ranging from rookie to competitive professional lobbies. As such, this can get complicated quickly, but I'll try to keep this as simple as possible. If you have played most other games, you should have a general understanding of one or most of these concepts, especially if you come from a tactical shooter or a battle royale, as understanding your resources in those types of games is a key to success, which is why you see battle royale players doing so well right out the gate if they start playing Apex. Everything in Apex can be summarized to a resource of some sort, such as your positioning, your health, your kills, and my favorite, your time. Not only are we going to cover these resources individually, but I'll paint a few scenarios in which these are traded. Tangible resources such as heals, ammo, shields are pretty self-explanatory, but loot such as weapons or higher level shields or other equipment are resources too, and can also be found on the ground. On a deeper level, all of these resources are again straightforward. You can find them on the ground and they elevate your gameplay in some way, either by giving you a way to heal up in a fight or giving you favorable chances when fighting enemies through an easier sight, a larger magazine, or easier to control recoil. It makes sense that you'll want to get as many of these items as possible, as every item you pick up will increase your survival rate, chance to win a fight, or even a chance to win a game by some percent. Abilities are also a form of resources. Different passives, tactical abilities, and ultimates all have their own intrinsic value, but unlike items are bound to a legend and will refresh infinitely. But depending on their cooldown, might have a finite amount of uses in a team fight, or in some cases, like Gibraltar's ultimate, with a 4.5 minute cooldown, a finite amount of uses in a game. Things like your team members and their own resources are in a way sort of a resource that can be used by the sum of the team's parts. Let's take it a notch deeper and look at some non-tangible resources. They're not actual items that you pick up, but they are valuable on their own. In a way, your position is another resource, a finite one at that. Depending on the position, its value will sway depending on a lot of other variables, such as where the zone pulls, the amount of enemy teams, and focus. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This resource is not necessarily called positioning. Instead, it's something slightly broader, more commonly known as space. Another concept which is probably the most valuable resource of them all, and when weighed against any other resource in the game, it's going to outweigh them significantly. You could also draw parallels to real life here, but I digress. That resource is time. Assuming you're playing from start to finish, you have an average of 20 to 25 minutes to play around with throughout an entire game. And completely, depending on how you use your time, you can leverage this into more resources and in turn make the game easier to win. What's interesting about having time as a resource, as a concept, is that any decision you make will always come at the cost of your time. Of course, the longer you stay alive, the more tangible points you will get, such as placement points, but the more time you have left in the bank, for example, if you're rotating into zone, the more space you have to rotate. If your positions are held in front of you, and the more time you have, the more chance you have to turn around and rotate elsewhere. Let me explain. If you don't have a lot of time, say you're rotating in late with zone closing behind you, you'll probably die to the first team in front of you who might be holding you out of the ring. I really hope you're following so far, because if you did, this might start making sense. The more resources that you have, the easier the game is. Think about that for a second and let it sink in. Every single decision that you make seems so much easier in comparison the more resources that you have. In most people's cases, they don't even stop to think about it. At most, they give it some thought on a surface level, like, oh wow, I have red armor, we'll win this fight easily. Not really taking other loot, such as weapons, attachments, and heals, or taking their space or their timing into consideration at all. Let me elaborate on that. If Apex is a game of resources, and everything can be summarized to a resource, that means that every action you take has a cost. Every time you loot, you trade time for items such as heals, ammo, and more. When you're trading shots with someone, you ideally trade your ammo and maybe a little bit of health for their ammo and health, along with some shield charge, assuming your shields aren't fully leveled up. Lost health or shields are generally healed at the cost of items, unless you're a lifeline Watson or whatever. We'll get more into this, but this is already where most people go wrong. Many players, when holding a position, or even when they're in the open, will shoot at enemies just for the sake of shooting at them, directly costing them ammo, risking themselves losing health or shields, thus healing items, costing them time they could have spent getting into position, and giving their position away while turning enemy focus towards them, costing them the space they could have used to move forward. On the flip side, many players might have a good position and do nothing with it. They're just sitting in their nice cozy spot and waiting for the timer to go down. They are directly trading their time for placement points. It's not a horrible trade, but incredibly inefficient. If you have a good position and nothing but time, and you have nothing else to do than just wait down the timer, try not to just trade your time for placement points. You'll get placement, sure, but your odds of winning or getting kills won't be that high if you just sit around. I mean, it's not really reasonable to expect people will just run into you. While still keeping control of your good position, see if you can clear some space by taking angles, maybe loot the surrounding areas, get information on the enemy teams, and depending on your situation, their loadout and their inventory. You can maybe even poke for some shield charge. If you sit away idly without doing anything, you'll trade your time for a position, but get nothing useful out of it, and you will lose out to teams that did something and ended up amassing more resources for the late game. Teams who loot fast and rotate early will trade most of their loot for the extra time, and will notice that rotations are significantly easier when nobody else is rotating. This is why in competitive Apex, there's been metas that are basically speedruns at any percent, where teams try to loot the bare essentials and then rush to get the god spot as early as humanly possible. If you don't have time on your side, you won't have space, as positions are taken and you'll run into roadblocks on the way to the zone, and every time you get held up, it gets increasingly difficult getting to where you want to be as everyone rotates in front of you. What's interesting is that some teams will instead choose to trade their time for loot rather than these early positions, space, and positioning. They've accepted that they can't get into the zone in a timely manner and instead assign the time that they have to get as much loot as humanly possible. All of this loot gives them a bit of an advantage when running into a fight, even when time isn't on their side, and makes trading with other teams much easier. They might have better armors, better weapons, and more heals, allowing them to out-heal and out-sustain other teams, and eventually push them when the time is right. These edge teams may not have god spots, but usually choose to carve their own space by fighting for it, and know that as long as they continue fighting, they can snowball and end up with a surplus of resources compared to passive teams, which is why you will see aggressive teams running through most lobbies in most levels of play, seeing as they have red armor and the loot from several teams on their side, and everyone they run into might just have blue or purple armors with very little loot to fight back. They choose to get as much tangible resources as possible, and hey, that works too. I wish I could give you a direct order of significance to all of these different resources, but it completely depends on your playstyle and what you already have. Generally speaking, time and space will be more valuable than additional loot, but you need a baseline of loot to actually have a fighting chance and getting good results in game. Now that you have an understanding of how resources work in Apex, it's time to implement it into your decision making, both in the grand scheme of things as well as your smaller decisions. Is taking this peak worth wasting resources for a little bit of damage and shooty? Should I stay here doing nothing as time ticks by? Should I try to hold one angle or maybe push up and claim as much space as possible? Every decision has a cost, either obvious or not, and I hope that assigning these values to them will make it easier for you to make the right choice. Apex is a game of resources, and if you start thinking of every game as a round of poker or go fish, you'll start seeing ways that you can improve your decision making throughout the entire game. A skill that you might want to learn to support this is movement, so check out the video on the screen to learn all the 5 levels of movement. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all tomorrow.